This is the nameless protagonist. I'd like to thank you guys again for participating in this next installment with Maggie Thompson Under the Veil as we delve into transpersonal and humanistic psychology. This is the third installment, and today's topic will be radical self-acceptance. I'm going to take just a couple minutes to make sure everybody has a little time to get in. And once we're here, we will open the dojo, bring our guest up, and get things going. Take a look and see who's here. You guys, if whoever's present here, press a 1 in the chat if you guys can hear me all right. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay. So we got a few people. We'll go ahead and do a couple nods. And get things cracking. We got Sick Diggy. He says, Salamat. Os. What's good, fam? Jay Cleveland. Os. Kareem Austin. Os. Lotus. I see he's changed up the art a little bit. I like it. Os. What's good, fam? Appreciate you. I figured it'd be fitting for today's topic. We have the little nameless temple going on in the background. Mike Carr, what's going on? Says you can only stay for a minute. No problem. No problem at all. With that, we'll go ahead and get things started since we're probably going to get a lot more people coming in as we roll forward. So, to the chat and the founders of the space, os. To those in the chat and those listening right now, os. This is the nameless protagonist. I'd like to thank you for your time. And as usual, today we will be going over, as we stated before, this idea of radical self-acceptance and critical framing of the nuance between defeat, loss, win, and success, and other related topics. And as per usual, I encourage you all to take what is useful and leave behind what is not. It's with that, we'll go ahead and bring in our special guest, Psychotherapist Maggie Thompson.
Hello.
What's going on? What's good? What's good? I think I can hear you guys okay. Go ahead and press 1 if you guys can hear, all right?
Yeah, we want to make sure you can hear me.
Yeah, we were having some disrespectful mic issues earlier. All right. Yeah, it looks like we're good. So we have a lot we can cover with this, and I thought that it would be good to kind of set this off with one of the points, some of the pre-recorded content I've already done, dealing with Miyamoto Musashi's work, The Dokodo, The Way of Walking Alone. And in the first precept, I think it speaks interestingly to the gist of the topic. And it's kind of interesting seeing this because I did this 4 years ago, this particular one, 5 years ago. Oh my goodness. So this will be a little bit of a time capsule for me, but I think these concepts still remain relevant in the present moment, even though it was written back in the 1600s. But let me do a quick share screen. And Dokodo. Right. I am going to, ooh, that looks ugly. Let me see if I can clean that up a little bit. We'll try theater mode. Okay, are you guys able to see that clearly?
Looks good from where I'm watching.
Okay. And I'm in the studio. It looks good in the studio. All right. I'm going to get the volume up a little bit. And we'll go.
すべてをそのまま受け入れます。第一、どこど、宮本武蔵。Would I like to elaborate on this precept? A recurring issue with perspective is this idea of what ought to be getting imposed rather than accepting it for what it actually is. Perhaps it has to do with the mind's tendency to organize things by virtue of its usefulness, relative to itself, of course. While this is merely the result of a defense mechanism developed by human psychology to protect itself from threat, the issue arises when this occurs in the realm of presupposition instead of actual experience. We see this socially in the form of stereotyping, but when applied to the world in general, the fruit often brought forth from this truth is usually bewilderment. Things have and always will be simply what they are, no matter how much we attempt to project them to be otherwise. If you can do this, you will avoid the mistake of chasing shadows that have been casted by your bias, and your mind will remain unmoved, able to respond correctly, no matter the situation one finds themselves in. Thus, one should accept things simply for what they are. Os.
So the beginning of that precept was the actual first line of the precept, which was simply accept things for what they are. And there are tendencies sometimes for people to mistake that sentiment as if it's a statement of a docile surrendering of one's agency to whatever circumstance they find themselves in. This is speaking to a completely different principle. When one speaks of radical self-acceptance, or as Miyamoto Musashi meant when he said accepting things for what they are, it's to get out of your own way in applying conscious and subconscious biases in ways that you can actually address. And having accepted things for what they are, you take time to address things for what you do have agency over, which is the way in which you respond to it all. And you find that from there, when you stop trying to take control of things and you accept it, even in a general sense in your everyday life, there is a way of energy efficiency that's made realized that you can even see in combat scenarios or trying to maintain balance on a shaky foundation. Instead of trying to fight a violent movement, if you can accept it, you learn to flow with it, and it will put you in a position to more clearly respond to the situation that you find yourself in. I think you would be more than surprised at how often that plays out in everything, to include and not be limited to your own personal progression and your ability to relate with other people.
I get so lost sometimes just listening to you, Nameless. I forget I'm supposed to talk. Well, something that you and I were just talking about was in dialectical behavioral therapy, the very first lesson that I work with people on is radical acceptance. And just to back up a little bit, radical means all encompassing. It's like when people say grossly, it's like all of it, not the word gross. Radical is not like radical dude. It's everything, all encompassing, all the things. So when we talk about radical acceptance, It's as above, so below, as within, so without. It's accepting yourself and inwardly and accepting everything outwardly, whether that be things that happened to you in your past or mistakes that you made or whatever happened or where you are in this moment. It's accepting it is what it is. You can't, you're fighting a losing battle by trying to fight something that you can't change. Like you were just saying, what can you control? What do you have agency over? And then also in accepting self. And it doesn't mean agreement. Acceptance is not agreement. So, as an example, I am not a tall person. I'm 5'2". And so I could, just as an example, I could concern myself and be annoyed at how short I am. Every time I need to reach something, okay, I'm annoyed, I'm short. Every time, I have to be tall enough to ride a ride. I don't know. I had that problem all the way into high school. But I can be worried about that all the time. I could be griping and complaining, or I can accept it about myself. I'm short. And so in that acceptance, instead of putting my energy towards complaining and concerning myself with being short, I put that energy into learning how to climb. So funny enough, like I have step stools. I have been known to stand on a kitchen countertop to reach high shelves or the top of the fridge because I can and still not hit my head. But I put my energy towards, when I accept it, I put my energy towards things that then that thing that I accepted about myself is not a negative. I'm not in agreement with it, but I also don't have any control over it. And so it just is what it is. And so I learned how to climb.
That entire concept is written all over Aikido. So the principle behind Aikido, when you break down the kanji, the active word in it is love. And the key to that, and remember what we mentioned this not on stream, but I'll reiterate this point here. When you look at love and fear as inverse polarities to one another, when you are animated in fear, there's this desire to control. So in Budo or martial arts in general, we have this sort of concept behind instinct and control. And the idea is to have a balance between the two. You have to have control enough to learn the technique. But the goal of learning the technique is so that you can let go of it and forget about it. And there's some people who get so caught up in control that they end up totally losing out to anybody with any form of instinct at all that's been conditioned and trained or realized through real, true adversity in real dynamic scenarios. So it's the difference between the people who only train in the dojo versus people who are on the street getting into actual fights and knew how to deal with being punched in the face. There's this idea of recognizing that if you try to control, especially every single movement you do, that there is a rigidness and a predictability that you have about you. There is a repelling factor that isn't going to get you what you're looking for. In the inverse, if you instead can accept, and that includes whatever it is your opponent does, every answer that your opponent offers you offers a solution that if you can accept what they give you, the opposite side for that answer is available for you to take advantage of. So through maintaining a measure of acceptance of the opponent, of the circumstance, of the ground, of your balance, of what's used, you can let go of the control enough to get the outcomes you're actually looking for. And it's so paradoxical because there's this idea that the moment you let up of control, again, back to that fear principle, that something that you're giving some sort of concession of power to something bigger than you in a way where you'll never get it back, that it was stolen from you, that you set some negative precedence. When in reality, I can't think of anything that's more liberating than to simply let things be as they will and then give myself the agency to respond as I see fit. I can, there's so many things you can find that is applicable to. And I think many of us can take a look at our lives and recall a time and a general pattern of being where that is our modus operandi, where we're doing the complete opposite of that.
Well, I think, and you hit on it, acceptance is not complacency. It's when you're looking at, is life happening to you or are you living your life? When you're responding to what's happening to you, you are living your life. And, like you were talking about when you're trying to have control over what you learn instead of, letting it go, that skill set that you've learned, it kind of comes back to that. Is it coming natural to you? Is it authentic? Is it just rising from within? And, when I hear you talk about fear and it being the opposite of love, and especially when we're talking about control, we can definitely apply that to radical self-acceptance, because if you don't love and accept yourself for who you are, what your skills are, what your faults are, if you haven't looked at how to use your skills to make up for your faults, and if you don't have that love and acceptance for yourself, then you want to control the things that you want to be, or that you're threatened by, or that you don't have the talent, or your way to live vicariously then becomes to control it because you're insecure about what other people have or what they can do that you think you can't. But maybe you can. You just have not evaluated yourself to figure it out.
Call that getting in your own way.
Yeah.
I really think that's the default setting for many people in society, and people are highly encouraged to be that way because tinfoil hat time, and no surprise or mystery to anybody, I think it's very easy to sell stuff to people that are operating on that type of time.
Well, I mean, you just look at commercials. I mean, commercials are very base level. It's like, if you wear this cologne, all the sexy women will love you. If you drink Coca-Cola, you are going to be happy. That's their big thing, by the way. Happiness equals Coca-Cola. If you're going to get the women, you're going to have the riches, you'll be able to drive this car. I mean, it's all very base level, but marketing was created out of psychology. So, and that's all it is it's psychological manipulation. So it is easy to sell people stuff who have these higher expectations, who are presenting themselves as something that they're not, who are living in deception, living a lie, not being authentic, afraid of looking like a fool, afraid of looking like a nerd, afraid of people won't like me. Then they're easy. Then all you got to do is sell them the next big thing, because then they're like, oh, if I have this, then people will really like me.
And it's so interesting how so many of these things can be addressed very early when people get the opportunity to recognize what it is they actually have. So you kind of made me think about what you said earlier about your height, for example. And I think about,
listen, we don't need to harp on it. Okay.
well, no, I mean, when I think to my taijutsu training in Nimpo, that was actually seen as a massive advantage. There were a lot of people who were complaining about being too tall. And part of that is just because of the foundations behind what we understand with our taijutsu is based on your grounding to the earth. So there's entire waza or skill sets that completely exploit and take advantage of the fact that you have a lower center of gravity, and
I am lower to the ground.
and it's so huge. The pattern that we always had drilled with us with taijutsu has always been take the balance, take the opponent over and over and over and over and over again. And it's like a running meme that people who were closer to the ground were just throwing people left and right all over the place all day forever. And so people hated that if they were taller. Hated it. It was just hilarious.
Long way to go.
Yeah. And, but that was the nature of the way these things were always taught. In the environment that these things came up with, there was no time to apply a greater than, lesser than modality. It's okay, take advantage of what it is you have, because there's no greater than, lesser than, there's just best and best to act. So when you can understand that there's a whole entire skill set that is catered to your predisposition, you can use that as your starting point to get an understanding of the entire body of knowledge. I think really this is a bigger issue in martial arts overall in the modern era. There's a tendency for people to copy the instructor. And so I remember earlier when I first started in martial arts with Taekwondo, our instructor was super tall, crazy long legs. And there's certain techniques that work really well. People who are boxers, they already know. People that got really long arms, people like Muhammad Ali, there's certain fighting styles that suit best to you. You don't try to copy what your trainer does. You train to work what's best with regards to your own personal assets. And the martial arts instructor we had, I was built completely opposite to him. And so the techniques that I was really, really good at involved doing completely utter opposite things, exploiting my tendency to have speed, but then longer than natural reach due to the way I'm built. So the way I trained wasn't necessarily the same as everyone else, but it was through finding what I was good at that I was able to build that foundation to get an understanding of the entirety of the spectrum and build from there. I think socially we're supposed to be given the same things. There are many of us that have different intellectual or sociological configurations starting by way of personality. And what's supposed to happen is these things should have been identified earlier in our development. And we find ways of relating to the aggregate starting from a position of our inherent strengths. But now that everybody's being corralled into this cookie cutter personality, if you're too far away from the cookie cutter template, what's your natural predisposition gets reframed as a problem that has to be trained or conditioned out of that. And oftentimes, I'm pretty sure you notice some of that at best case scenario manifests as a lack of self-acceptance.
Well, yeah, it definitely does. And you just were making me think about, I used to work with teenagers quite a bit, and you would have teenagers, people ask kids all the time, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I always taught my kids to answer that question with the answer is taller. So, because you don't know what you want, right? We're not going to try to predict the future. But, when you become a teenager and you're trying to figure out, do I go to college? Do I not go to college? Do I go to Vo-Tech? Am I going to the military? Am I just going to live on my own? Am I backpacking Europe? You have all of these things in front of you. And so many of these teens would say, these different things that they want to do. And immediately their parents would know. Because a lot of times what teenagers, they have a little bit of twinkle in their eye about what the world is like. And so you may have somebody who says, I want to be an artist, or I want to be a rapper, or I want to be a singer, or, I want to be a painter, I want to be a dancer, all of these things. And you immediately get this, well, what are you going to do to make money? And you got to pay your bills, and you got to have something to fall back on, and you better go get an MBA, and you can dance on the side. Or, it was, the cage was snapped down pretty quickly, even if some of these kids had been dancing for years, or had been singing, or had been in art classes. They had been, because as a child, your parents may invest in that. But as soon as it came time for you're getting close to launch, the dreams are dashed.
And it's pretty pervasive, because it's not just the parents you're going to get that from. You're going to get that from the institution as well, and in particular. And it seems as though, which sucks, there's not a lot of room for that post-industrial first world, even though paradoxically you would assume that the industrial first world environment would have opened the gates for more of that to happen. But what's interesting is that seems to correlate almost, I don't even know if I can say that, but I noticed that the extremes, so people who had a lot of money could pursue that, and people who didn't have a lot of money seem to pursue that. The majority of people who were on the mean, they're the ones that, and that's mathematically where you'd find the majority of your talent, they're the ones that are most discouraged from doing it.
Right. And you're right, because when you look at the extremes, like you look at the wealthy, or you look at people, kids who grew up in abject poverty, at both ends of that spectrum, it's a circle, because at both ends of that spectrum, money doesn't matter. When you're in abject poverty and there is no money, you don't care about money, because there isn't any. So you have the ability to do whatever it is you're going to do.
Yeah, there's a measure of freedom that seems pretty paradoxical. And there's a lot that really rhymes with that principle being identified there. I think that when it comes to the liberal arts overall, that medium, the majority of society is very absent, weirdly so. But I think it does tie again a lot to the whole idea of there's nothing to lose, or you've got the freedom to lose, which probably is a good segue getting into, I guess, the shadow point that's associated with this. This, I won't call it an obsession with winning. I will call it an unhealthy relationship with failure, and a lack of framing these outcomes in a way that is of service to you. I think that's how I'll start. So I'll say this, and then you can go ahead and jump on there.
Okay.
I'll make the premise that I believe that for every 1 unit of for every 1 unit of success, it's common to have 8, 9, 10 times the amount of failure in order to get there. And so if you obsess and identify with the idea that you failed, that leads to you being defeated, which is a very different thing. And that in modern eras right now, we have been taught to take failure out of context, and we don't value the process that leads to success, or we overvalue the success. So when it's acquired, it's lost its meaning in inertia.
I have multiple things to say.
Go ahead and rock with it.
I'm going to try to keep my thoughts straight. I may have to start writing down notes to remember what I'm going to say. So the first thing I want to say real quick is, when I first have people come to me for therapy, the way I explain what mental health is, so that they know what the expectations are for therapy, is that it's like a teeter-totter. So, Nameless, when you were a kid, did you ever stand in the center of a teeter-totter?
out of, I guess you could say, morbid curiosity. Not often though.
Right, but so you try to balance the teeter-totter, right? You stand in the center,
right,
and you try to balance the teeter-totter. That's life,
right?
Okay. Where you came from is the pole that goes into the ground. So your family, if you have money or don't have money, if there's food in the fridge, whatever, is the strength of the pole that goes into the ground. A weak pole makes it harder to balance. And what happens is that we are given negative things and positive things. So our negative things go on one side of the teeter-totter, and our positive things go on the other side of the teeter-totter. And we continually try to balance. But when you get too much of either side, not just the negative, when you get too much of either side, that's how you get out of balance. And that's where where mental health and emotional issues start to play in. But in this society that we live in, because we have to earn baseline, what happens is anything positive, we feel like we have to counterbalance with a negative. So as an example, if I get up in the morning and I'm like, you know what, I want a manicure today. What I'm going to do is, okay, before I go get the manicure, I'm going to go switch the laundry out, and I'm going to make sure that I start the dishwasher. And then on the way to get my nails done, I'm going to stop and vacuum out the car. And I'm adding all these chores and tasks and negative things on one side to earn the positive thing. But unfortunately, we're already handed all these negative things all day, every day, and we're owed giving ourselves love. We are owed all of these positive things, but we just keep the negative as heavy as it can possibly be, and just through our sheer will try to balance these things out. And then we're surprised when we develop anxiety and depression and ADHD and all these other things, because we are owed loving ourselves, because the world gives us negative stuff all the time. The challenge of life is to maintain that balance. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. But then you were talking about shadow and ego. The shadow side of that, the way I look at ego is similar to that teeter-totter, because the bigger the ego, the bigger the shadow. The ego and the shadow have to balance each other out. So if I have a very big shadow, I have a very big ego. And shadow comes from all the negative things that have happened to us, all the trauma, the heartache, the pain, the tears, the abandonment from childhood on. And the way that we live in balance is to get ego and shadow as small and as balanced as they possibly can be. And they have to work in conjunction. And that ego is where expectations and, if only I was X, Y, Z, if I'm so concerned about not living up to standards and what my pictures look like on Insta and all these things, it is all a mask. That's why they call the ego the mask. It's all a mask to cover up the little squishy guy on the inside that is your shadow. And so the shadow side, is the fear, is the control, but it comes from the insecurity, the dislike of self, because we're running so hard and masking so hard that shadow instead of accepting it for what it is. And God forbid, people don't want to show their vulnerability. They don't want to show their emotions. They don't want to show their pain, mostly because the world will be a-holes about it and treat people crappy. But at some point, when you accept yourself, it doesn't matter how people respond. It just doesn't. You're like, hey, I like me. It's fine. And then the last thing you talked about, so before I forget, is you were talking about multiple failures to one success. A lot of that as part of radical acceptance. If we are radically accepting things, we would never use the term failure. We would, before we get to success, we have lessons, not failures. So if what I'm trying to do is, I'm just going to keep going with the short thing because I already said it. If I'm trying to put something on the top of the fridge And so I jump up to put it on the top of the fridge. Well, that's not very stable and it rolls off. Then I learned, okay, if I jump and try to put it up there, it's unstable. It's not a failure. I learned that jumping is not going to get that thing up there. Sorry.
No. Keep going, because I'm going to jump in right after you.
Okay. And so I just keep trying different things, right? So maybe I put the thing, on the end of a stick and try to get it up there. But then again, it's still not balancing. And eventually I get to where I'm using a step stool and I can see where I'm putting it and I can place it strongly and I can see where it might roll off. I can see what I'm putting it on because I learned all the lessons along the way. None of those were failures. It was me seeing how not to do it.
So I think that there is a English syntax issue that I run into, and I'll put an asterisk here, and I will say, in my subjective opinion, I am absolutely fine with this word failure, because the key is there's a tendency for people to identify with that word. For me, it's part of the process. It's acceptable if I failed to create perpetual energy. But what I did do is I got a step closer. So that's part of that radical aspect that I see, that I accept. And it's, again, born from having experienced it so much. I can say that I don't want to say that there's a callous to it, but there's a different way that you observe it. I mean, it'd be like you're trying to turn. Okay. If you're trying to get through a year, you got 365 days, typically, unless it's a leap year. Depending on how you frame it, you can say you failed to reach the next year, but you got one step closer. I'm using that example to really highlight the ridiculousness of how people view non-success, and not understanding that success is just a series of failures that are met to completion. And I think, again, we're speaking to the same point you're talking about, where those, quote, failures are actually lessons. If you invert that to scientific modality, it's the scientific process. It's testing, it's bringing your theory to hypothesis, and from hypothesis to experimentation. Okay, the experiment failed, but a failed experiment doesn't mean that, you as a human being and an entity with consciousness are now some failure that doesn't deserve to exist. It's the implications that aren't said that lead to the problem that I see. It's the emotional inertia placed on this word fail that I wanted to bring a light to, and why I called it the shadow of control. That whole concept. So I see failure again as just a part of the process, because here's what can happen, and here's what often happens, and I'm sure you see this a lot. If you take a team that's in the NFL, and let's say they are defeated in every single game they play, let's say they just win by 1 point. Because, we're going off of dichotomy win-loss, right? Let's say every game they play, they lose by a single point. However that fans out, whether it be a field goal, lack of a touchdown, etc., they lose. But the whole game, every time you see them play, it's really, really close. It's not like these are just terrible players. If you look at their record, and their whole entire record is leading with straight losses, you would formulate an idea about that team. But when you look at the absolute placement of these players, they could be in the Super Bowl, lose the game, and still be some of the best players on planet Earth. It's when you lose your sense in the absolute scope of things, when you lose the meaning behind the failure, the meaning behind the movement, the meaning behind why you're doing something, it's in that loss of meaning that these failures can end up being things that you identify with. And it's when you identify with the failure or accept the implications that other people impose upon that, which is where I think the majority of this is coming from, that you run into that issue. Let's take one of those players that are on this team, right? They can fill their entire timeline with people that are in the media, people that are in social media, in their immediate lives, you know, people that may know them. Millions of people will call this person a failure, even though they are one of the most apex human beings as far as raw talent, capability, and performance. Just because they're part of a team that lost, they now have to deal with a lifetime's worth of ridicule. People will say, well, that's part of the process. But that's where people can miss the bigger picture. If they accept the projected mirror image of who you are by virtue of this idea of failure, that's where the failures begin to weigh you down.
Mm-hmm.
And you miss sight of the meaning behind the movement.
And I think that comes from we get overly invested in other people's definition of success, so that if we're not meeting that definition, you know, if we're not wearing a suit to work every day and bringing home $100,000 every year, or we're not whatever, you know, insert whatever expectations. If we don't win the Super Bowl every year, then you're a loser. And if we overly identify with other people's expectations, or even with our own, you know, if I set up a specific expectation for myself that means success, and then I'm not looking at my failures as a way to learn, then if an even bigger success or an even better way to do it presents itself, I'm going to ignore it because I'm so overly invested in that one rigid definition of success, and I put way too much emphasis on it that I miss everything else. It's that just really becoming one with some definition that's actually not authentic to who you are.
And, you know, it's frustrating because, generally speaking, when you bring these points up, it gets taken as some sort of advocacy for mediocrity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is a big reason why I stress the concept of Kaizen and the idea of, if you're going to engage in competition, let it be with yourself. I mean, I think that is an excellent tool to view this idea of spiritual cultivation by using your body as a metaphor and your mind serving as an intermediary software that disciplines that process. And your metric unit of comparison is just simply the you of yesterday. Animated by that radical acceptance, there is always something to gain. Let's say you didn't gain in a physical sense. You lapsed somewhere. Did you do something to improve your mind? Let's say you lapsed somewhere and you didn't even try to learn anything. How well were you in observing your emotional state when something occurred? An excellent exercise to observe that would be while you're driving. And I would get so upset when I'm driving sometimes. I'm out here in Texas and these trucks are just super disrespectful. They don't give a damn. And, you know, it's easy to really get frustrated and upset. I think an excellent drill is to simply remind yourself that ultimately at the end of the day, while you're behind that wheel in that car, there is no way that truck driver is going to hear what you're saying, understand what you're going to do, or is in a position to care about what you have to say or think about that. So as you get upset and allow for your mental state to get disturbed, that's a loss you're accumulating. That's a line of stress that in the time that you're in your car, on your way to work, on your way back, while you're running errands, while you're doing whatever, that is a source of artificial stress that you don't have to consume. that you could use as an opportunity to consciously let go of. And what I find is like a muscle, like a trained muscle. You can condition your spirit to remain still in a situation where you want to be upset without denying what you're actually experiencing. You can acknowledge, accept how you feel, and let it go in the same motion. And I think that is a profound tool when put in the proper perspective that can allow for you to have greater agency over things that occur and a recognition over those things that we were mentioning earlier that you can and can't control.
Yeah. It reminds me of there's some thought in metaphysics, about that the universe is going to keep giving you your lessons until you learn them. And so, it kind of sort of goes along with the, that Christian concept of everything happens for a reason, although I think that breeds complacency. But it's sort of like if you use the traffic, which I was just driving in Texas this last weekend. So, I feel
You
for
know what
you.
I'm talking about.
Yes, I feel for you. It's terrible. And no rules apply in Texas. It's interesting. But
At all.
I think, impatience is one of those things that happens when you're driving because you have become over focused on the success, i.e., getting there. For me, success is to get to where I'm going to. So I'm overly focused on success and not the lesson. And so if I keep hitting every red light, oh, well, there aren't red lights in Texas. Everything is a highway. If I keep getting cut off by somebody going slow and they keep slowing me down, then this concept of metaphysics of the universe is going to keep giving you your lessons is when you get annoyed and then you have to calm yourself down and show patience, then it's the universe is going to give it to you again to make sure that you actually learned the lesson. So the harder you fight learning the lesson, then it's actually going to take longer to get there because these things that you won't learn will keep presenting themselves and you have to learn to be grateful for them. And so if you struggle, like myself, I will struggle with impatience when I'm driving. And so if I keep getting cut off by somebody going slow or I'm not able to pass and go around or whatever, I'm also a speed demon. So then, I will have to stop and breathe and be thankful for the lesson. This is a great opportunity for me to work on patience and just taking my time, and I'll get there when I get there. And I don't have to be overly focused on getting there as fast as I can. That one rigid definition of success that I had in the beginning of this car ride.
And I think it's interesting how that plays out because there are times where even when I don't have to, I'll oftentimes challenge myself while I'm on the road also to understand that I can. So there'll be times where, and it's not putting anybody in danger, I'll be like the only person there seeing
Not
the limits of
not.
what I'm able to do. Well, depending on when you go. Yeah, shout out to Texas and these freaking trucks. You really do need to be low-key hyper precognitive out here and see 30, 50 steps ahead of people.
Yeah.
Because they, bigger is everything out here. So if you've got anything that's a sedan level, you're driving on hard mode. But I think that's the point, though, to be able to accept that challenge and to see it as an opportunity to train. I guess that's how I would describe that. It's, to me, this is all a form of training. I'm reminded of a passage here from Daidoji Yuzan in his book that he wrote in the 1600s. It was a manual that he was writing for people during the Edo period when major wars, excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. A period where major wars were no longer taking place and the Tokugawa administration was in control, and Japan had that 200 plus years of complete peace. And I'm gonna put that in quotes. They just didn't have any issues with the foreign country. He wrote a particular line here that always got my attention as it relates to this. I'm gonna go ahead and read it here real fast. The chapter is labeled, quote, surpass others in some way, end quote. Daidoji Yuzan says, no matter how high or low his rank, the man who would be a warrior must have a good understanding of the meaning of the character katsu, which means to win. More specifically, the character to win is also read, quote, to excel, end quote. And in many cases, a man who does not surpass others in some way cannot be said to be a good warrior. For example, if a man were to spend long years putting effort into learning all the martial arts and yet did not become a master of those arts, he would have excelled others if he could at least be thought of as generally skillful. In serving his lord, on the other hand, if a man goes beyond many of his companions and has discharged his duties well in the eye of all, he is said to have served in a way that has excelled others. Above all, at times of altercation on the battlefield, to think of advancing when others are doing so, or to make a stand along with others, is neither very impressive nor praiseworthy. But for a single man to advance when all his compatriots consider it impossible, or to hold his ground when others cannot make a stand, is the mark of a brave warrior who has excelled. Beyond these things, it is essential for a man to strive with all his heart and to understand that it is difficult even to reach the average if he does not have the intention of surpassing others in whatever he does. These are words for the understanding of those intended to be warriors. When I read that chapter, I sat with it for a very, very long time. And I ended up writing something in response to this. I won't go over it today because I don't want to spend the live stream going over stuff I've written, but it presented to me an important nuance that he did highlight there, that this idea of winning and excelling doesn't need to be at the approval of others. The theme I think he was trying to highlight here is doing things that are in accordance to your nature and how you are as a human being. So when I mentioned Kaizen earlier, later on Miyamoto Musashi would go on to kind of talk about that particular line. And I agree with his statement and his perspective on it, which is the one that you need to surpass is the old you. And it's not from a matter of greater than or lesser than. It's to understand that all of these things are nothing more than fuel for you to continue and acquire the lessons that you were meant to learn, as you were mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And you are destined to follow in this cyclic pattern. I don't want to bring in karma into the conversation, but that's exactly what it ends up being. If you can orient yourself and take a step back away from the pixelated era and see the actual picture, I think it's easier to accept things for what they are, because you understand that in the end, when you really look at the final result, all of these things led to you becoming more than what you were yesterday, or at minimum, realizing more of what you are and engaging in the art of what I like to try to call the art of getting out of your own way.
Mm-hmm. I think, you just made me think about about in getting out of your own way is this sort of controlling what you can control. In that acceptance doesn't mean complacency. So in trying to excel, in trying to be better than you were, is also understanding that if there is anything that you want changed about yourself, about your life, about any of it, you have the choice to sit and complain, or to hide from it, or to try to escape from it, to ignore it and pretend like it's not there. Or you can eat an elephant, you one bite at a time. You can make changes, you can make plans and do little things every single day to address the thing that you do not like, because no one else is going to fix your life, because everybody is on their own journey. Everybody has to address the lessons that they are here to learn, or what it is that they're here to accomplish. And we all have our hands full, and there's a lot of people who just want to be in everybody else's business, when we have our hands full with ourselves. And so it was making me think of that complacency piece, that if you just do a little bit better each time you're presented with something, not so that you can be better than other people, so you could assuage yourself saying, well, I'm better than others, but because that helps you to control your life, to control your destiny, and control what your life looks like.
I think that is overlapping with some serious aspects of despair, and why I emphasize this idea of courage and its formula being strength in mind, body, and spirit, animated by belief, not just in oneself, but that all things are as they should be. And when you can have that serve as a pillar, I think that courage can be the tool that pushes you out of this control mechanism and gives you the capacity for acceptance, because it's rooted in something. When you've got those, as you described in the chat, this idea of Kaizen with micro victories, those things serve as a justification so you can move out of this realm of belief and into knowledge. You have as a fact, you accomplished this. You have as a fact, you've progressed in that way. You have for a fact that you can demonstrate within yourself a measure of growth. And from there, build a foundation of competence in oneself that can serve as that platform for courage. So it allows for your doubt to serve the tool that it's meant to, identify new areas of potential growth, rather than using it as some sort of negative association with something that you haven't acquired. And I'm saying that because I think that one of the greater triggers, and this is me getting into my observation as in subjective opinion, I'm not an expert on this, that one of the keys to despair is the belief that you can't get better or you can't improve. And the final step to that is, from there, then believe that you are now a burden on others as a result. I think that it is absolutely imperative that a reframing of what is considered success, or the capacity for an individual to change in particular, and why I am extremely fond of this idea of the koi, that knowing that you can be better than you of yesterday, and over time that small digression can become a tremendous digression, and you can assume the mantle and become that which you do set your mind to with time and consistency.
You just made me think of, and I don't know who said it or how they said it, but it was somebody said something like, the worst thing you can do is kill me. And it makes me think about something that I say, and I recently had to be reminded about this. But something that I say a lot is, no matter what, at the end of the day, I'm going to be okay, because I trust in my own resilience. So no matter what happens, I am resilient and I can respond to it, and I will address it when it happens. I'm not going to sit and fret and worry about what hasn't happened. I will address what happens when it happens, and things hurt, and I fail at things, and people do things that hurt me, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. But at the end of the day, I will be okay. I will be fine, because that courage, I think, comes from resilience. And the despair and hopelessness is when, yes, you become helpless, because you feel like you can't affect a change on your material circumstance, or that everything you do is wrong or isn't going to do what you want it to do, or it's not good enough, or it's all these feelings of insecurity that maybe we were told as children, or we've had boyfriends or girlfriends, husbands, wives, whatever, telling us these things, to where we don't have any trust in our ability to handle life as it comes.
Which is why having that immediate visceral experience with the cultivation of strength in mind, body, and spirit, resilience being one of those pillars that manifest as a consequence, I don't see any way around it. And it's why I strongly advocate for it. I think that the cultivation of the personality is an excellent start, which is why I think, well, it's probably where a lot of people start with. I think there is profound value in having an idea of your starting point. I find it really, maybe it's just my nature. I'll speak for myself. I was thrilled learning about concepts presented in MBTI and astrology to get a sense for what my nature is. Because growing up, all I ever had and all I was ever told was how different I am to everything. So my logic would bring me to say, all right, well, if I'm so different, then how am I acclimated? The unspoken implication is that if it doesn't fit the cookie cutter, you just don't have it. And if you do have something, it's not valuable.
It's
and
just
I found,
wrong.
or yeah, there's some sort of judgment that's applied to it. And again, it's not necessarily that anyone says this. It's the implication that is there because of what's not said. What you're not presented is, what are your strengths and advantages? Let's diagnose or examine you for your tendencies and how we can cultivate that into an alternative way for you to get the exact same thing. And I found that studying things like MBTI and getting into deeper aspects of astrology, like the aspects and all the different placements that are attributed to you, having that starting point and getting your sort of stat sheet helps you understand how you can calibrate and interpret your experience more personally. And I find it very interesting that in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, medical treatment is starting to go in that direction as well. And I think it's only going to be a benefit going forward.
You see medical treatment going in the way of really knowing people's tendencies?
What I mean is more personalized treatments. So I'll give you an example. As our ability to gain more sophisticated data, specifically biometric data on a particular individual, you can more specifically tailor modalities of treatment for the individual patient, animated in a general common knowledge, to have a better targeted efficacy of treatment for certain things. Whereas now it's like, throw everybody antibiotics and aspirin and call it a day.
Yeah. We do that in psychiatry, where when people come in with something that may require some medication, and I am not a huge proponent of medicating things right off the bat, especially mental health concerns, but some things need medication right off the bat. Somebody is very suicidal or homicidal or having psychosis, then, we need some meds to get us through until we figure out what's causing it. But if a person is medication resistant, or like the standard medications aren't really doing the trick, then they do DNA testing to see what medications are going to be most effective for that particular person, so that they can tailor the prescriptions to that person's DNA.
Didn't know that part particularly. That's interesting.
Yeah. So you will have psychiatrists. I know a few who, if somebody comes in to see them, to talk about medication, one of the first things they ask for is for the DNA blood test, because they don't want to just trial and error psychiatric medications for people, especially when they are in, these pretty severe states.
That's interesting. So it means that since they've already got that pattern, as they start to get into more, I won't say advanced, I will call them subtle forms of treatment, such as nutritional augmentation. I'm sure you've done or are familiar with some of the research coming out now with the micro gut biome and the vagus nerve.
One of my certifications is integrative mental health, which has to do with integrating nutrition and spirituality into treatment.
Oh, I'm speaking your language then.
Yeah.
This goes over most people's head. They got no clue all the massive peer review research that's come out on that. And I've been meaning to do some videos on that. Actually, we'll asterisk that. Let's dig into that in the future, because I think that is cool information for people to know, because a lot of this stuff is actionable right now. You could just call it intellectual hygiene. That's all. That's how I'm going to identify it as.
Yeah.
Because it's really a maintenance conversation.
It really is. Yeah.
But yeah, all of that to say that's part of having the agency to really start over from scratch, getting your tailored stats so you understand what you as an individual are best at. Because I don't think the universe makes mistakes. And it may sound cliche, but I think there really is something to taking time to recognize what talents you may have, or having an acceptance of yourself enough to get a grounding of what you are or aren't good at, and then formulating a strategy off of that and moving forward. Because what I find is, when you intentionally engage with yourself and cultivate yourself, have an understanding of who you are, the intellectual dexterity that you engage with other people, the world around you, and more importantly, yourself, gives you such a level of clarity that your outcomes tend to be more so in favor rather than against, even if somebody may theoretically be, quote, better at you with something or for something.
Yeah. I mean, I think about like people who are neurodivergent or on the spectrum, just really do not enjoy small talk, like surface level. How's the weather? How's your job, Bob? They just don't. And I tend to not like it either. I'm like, I want to know what your favorite dinosaur is. But so if you continuously interact with people and everybody is doing small talk, then you're going to have this tendency to think, okay, there's something wrong with me, because small talk is like fingernails on a chalkboard. Like, I hate this crap. But then if you read a piece of paper, okay, so say you go to a therapist and the therapist says, hey, let's do some tests. I think there's something else going on here. And then says, okay, well, you are having autistic tendencies. And so that means, or people with this diagnosis tend to. So just like if you have your birth chart done, and different houses are telling you the tendencies, it's not pre-programmed. Well, your sun sign is in Taurus, so you are stubborn.
Right.
It's these are tendencies, right? So in the same way, when you have something else confirm what you already know, it creates a level of acceptance. So in learning yourself, you take the MBTI, or you take an MMPI, or some kind of personality test, or you get your birth chart, you do these things and you're reading these things, these tendencies about yourself. Some may apply all the time. Some you may have already fixed, or you may have already addressed, or may have already gotten past, but just seeing that normalizes it to a point where you can accept it much better. When you accept it, when you're able to say, there is very much a trend of everybody saying that they're autistic. And I kind of don't like that, because it really takes away people who are struggling with autism, and society's never been very kind to people with autism. So it's a little annoying when people are, I got a touch of the tism, but
Like
If
how everyone just became a nerd and a comic book fan out of
right,
nowhere.
exactly.
I'm with you.
But when you do maybe get that diagnosis and you're able to say, you know what, I'm autistic and I just am not into small talk. So can you guys call me when we're going to talk about this, the particular thing about like when we're actually going to pick out the movie? It gives you that courage to accept yourself enough to present yourself to others very authentically and honestly, to where then they know how to work around you. And then you're going to get, well, Maggie's autistic. And so let's finish our conversation. Then we'll call her when it's time to pick the movie or when we're going to talk about our favorite dinosaurs. And I'm not saying I am or I'm not autistic. I'm just using myself as an example.
Linguistic example, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I have children who are autistic. I have a father who is autistic. I have many people in my family. And that's one of the biggest examples I see is that diagnosis actually is, as much as it's a label and we don't necessarily want to label people and pigeonhole people, that particular one is very freeing to people.
Yeah, because it applies context. It gives you that aha. And so now you can reorient and recalibrate, which I think is critical here. Yeah, and there we go back to this idea of it's not that there is better and lesser, it's there's best for and best at. And everybody has these interesting, unique distributions of potentiality. And even though it may not be evenly distributed, with enough time and consideration, you will find that there's always something you can do as a baseline human being, that just the givens faculty wise that you're given, the ability to process information, there is capacity for you to be able to change favorably. It's just you may require a different strategy or different tactics to make it happen. And I think that human beings historically had a better grip on this because I don't think we had much of a choice historically. But now that you can get by with less, and the definition of getting by has become more commercialized and cheapened in many ways, that we're finding that human beings are more diverse with their configuration, their budget of cognitive allocation may differ and they may have been spent differently, but that doesn't mean they're lesser. And in many instances, they may actually be key to innovating, which I think we're about to really come to terms with very soon. Now that our talent pool has been essentially cut off, and not to make it a political conversation, we're going to have to figure this out. And I think that the way people do a self-reflection on what this concept of talent means, or this idea of being able to be useful to oneself, this not usefulness, but your capacity for adapting and adjusting to various environments. I think that our strength as human beings is in the many different ways we can come across to find answers to the same thing. And that oftentimes this definition of what we're calling failure, the only reason why it quote failed is just because there was a lack of correct environment, or the timing was wrong, or things that were outside of your control were the case. And if it was the same thing in a different circumstance, not only would it have been a success, it may have been a critical success. It could have been a key innovation. So revisiting those failures, not to identify with them, but to continue to learn from them, is a profoundly useful tool. So maybe a particular personality didn't work. Maybe now that we've got all of these advents with the fourth industrial revolution, certain concepts and personalities now fit and are ideal. I'm thinking of autism right now in its various spectrums.
I totally agree. I mean, there are a lot of things that we have discovered because something quote unquote failed. I mean, just I'm thinking of medications again.
Shout out to penicillin.
Right. But I'm thinking like a lot of the mental health medications that we utilize did not start out as a mental health medication. As a matter of fact, there's one ADHD med, Ritalin, and then the SSRI class of antidepressives, which is like the Prozacs, those SSRIs, are the only ones that were specifically made for mental health. Everything else that we have, they're called atypicals because we will give people medication for bipolar that's a blood pressure medicine, or we will give people anti-seizure medication because the side effects are that it treats mental illness. And that's just one little piece of that, is that it's a quote unquote failure because it doesn't treat the blood pressure very well, but it sure does help people who are bipolar to not go into psychosis. So it's still a success.
But if you threw it all away,
Yep.
and you fire the doctor because they didn't make the organization money, there you go. You understand what I'm saying? And that's where, this whole idea of returning to the abyss for inspiration. And I want to distinguish. There's a spiritual aspect to going into the abyss that does relate to internal cultivation and growth. It reminds me of the idea of the lotus, where it forms a kind of soil with which you can take these units that have been decomposed over time through nature and recirculate them into newer, not necessarily newer, but concepts that can be relevant in the present moment. I think that that's the value in looking back on these things. The problem is if you stay in the dirt and don't move beyond that, or you identify with those things being in a state of decay, that you miss the value that's there, which is those raw nutrients. Understanding the context under why something failed is profoundly beneficial. In warfare, that's 90% of intelligence work, is understanding and learning from past conflicts, observing the behavior of whoever it is you're about to engage with. Sports, they do the same thing. It's the whole purpose behind, quote, rolling the tapes. There's so many fields where these things apply. And it's interesting to observe people fail to recognize that they can apply those same principles to their own interpretation of reality in life. It doesn't have to be restricted to those modalities, that it can expand to self-acceptance, and through self-acceptance, acceptance of things as they are. And in that way, win and loss just becomes byproducts of the same process of understanding and learning.
Well, it's like that statement, no matter where you go, there you are. And if that statement upsets you or makes you sad, then that tells you something that you need to change. If that statement makes you happy, that even if I'm in the abyss, I'm there with myself. Because no matter where I am, there I am.
That is uplifting.
I
There's
am
a
never
grounding
alone.
point to that.
Yeah, because, I think about therapists as an example, social workers, healing arts people. Their job is to heal others through their care. And burnout is a huge, huge thing. You get that in customer service too, where you're constantly giving. Because the thing is that, like, for myself, my job has always been to heal other people with my care, with my love, right? That's my medicine, is my caring to heal other people. But I always have to remind myself to give myself a taste of my own medicine, right? I can heal myself with what I'm giving to everybody else, because no matter where I go, there I am.
That's the idea that I'm mentioning when I speak about unconditional love. And it's I don't mean that in the way oftentimes that's interpreted of giving things just for the sake of it. It's from having cultivated that internal orientation, that solar modality of acceptance. You have a consistent source that you can draw from, and it's so abundant that there is a remainder that can be shared really as a byproduct. You can cultivate so much self-love that isn't selfish in nature, but self-accepting, to where that abundance is like a fruit that you can then share to other people, to the point where they can be overwhelmed by that. And there's a difference between that type versus a kind that has to be animated through control, out of fear of not having it. So it offers that as a kind of tribute in question of, will you accept me? Here's all of this. Versus, I have all of this abundance, take it or leave it.
Well,
and there's
just
almost an indifference towards it. Yeah, go ahead.
it just sort of drips off. You know, it's like that parable of Jesus and people kissing his garments. You know what I mean? And then they're blessed and healed and whatever. You know, it drips off. It again, and I brought up Ram Dass the last time we talked, but it reminds me of that, where when you know that who you are really doesn't have much to do necessarily with the meat sack avatar that you are in. Who you are animates that meat sack. And you have to take care of the avatar that you're in because you love who you are. You know, you want who you are to be as healthy as possible. And so there is this sort of almost parasitic relationship of the you that you are is using this avatar. And so you have to keep the avatar healthy. But when I bring up Ram Dass, it's because, you know, you talk about this when you have so much self-love. You know, one of the biggest things I do that seems to help in therapy is so simple. And it's just seeing people, just see the person, who they are inside there. Like, not what their avatar looks like, not anything that tells me or any presuppositions that I have about any of it. Yes, that plays into their experiences, but just seeing somebody simply because I know that I'm in here, and Ram Dass always says, "Are you in there?" I'm in here, far out. You know, that because it's just seeing the person for who they are, the them that is inside.
That's why I like the comedic reference of the body being a lamp. This whole concept of Ka and Ba. So that relationship that you were describing, I see it again as a training tool. It's the goal was always to cultivate the spirit. And it's interesting how the body can serve as a microcosm and metaphor to the universe. It's like an operating system that gives you a filtered access. And it's as if the training exercise is, with all of these limitations, animate yourself with the principle of what you are and reconstruct that with these limitations to get a greater or an additional degree of who you are. To me, that's the definition of cultivation.
Yeah, it's a video game. I mean, you put on your VR goggles and you go into the video game that is life and reality, and you have your player, and you know, you can play the game or you can just sit under a tree. But when you play the game, you have to fight sometimes, and you have to win sometimes, and then you have to go find the boxes and the health and the food and the different power-ups and the mushrooms and whatever to then, I mean, I think Pokemon, you know, then you evolve into the next thing. So again, are things happening to you in life, or are you living? Are you playing the game? You have this opportunity. You're now in the avatar, you're in the game, you're in reality. You literally can make this game whatever it is that you want to make it. Are you going to do it, or are you going to hate everything that's happening. Every game has a challenge. Then there's always a villain.
I think we just stumbled across our next topic.
Okay.
This idea of transcendence in the avatar and what it means to quote unquote progress. You know, and there's a lot of different ways that plays out where, you know, there's more than one way one can play, end quote.
Yeah.
You know, and we're all sharing the same server perhaps, but there's more than one way to succeed. There's no one singular formula. And there's so many ways that you can learn from other people, which gives us back to this idea of human intrinsic value, which I think is something I think it needs more attention. And I think it needs more attention outside of a charity perspective, but out of really being able to appreciate what it takes for a human being to get here, to be functional in existence, and the lessons they can offer you by their existence that people may be missing. And I think that's definitely worth respecting.
I agree.
In an inherent sense. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree. But I always have this statement where, you know, I love humans, but I'm not much of a people person. Because
Right. Because y'all got a lot going on. And I got a battery. So
sometimes people are messy and mean and violent and vile. And, you know, so I'm not even a therapist saying this. I'm not much of a people person, but I love humans. Because I think when people embrace their humanity, whatever that looks like to them, it's beautiful. It doesn't always happen, though, because people don't embrace their own humanity.
That's part of that radical self-acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when people are truly who they are, there are things that they can teach you, even if that lesson is stay the hell away. I can appreciate that lesson. And I think if you are out of your own way and self-accepting enough to understand where you are, you can extrapolate that lesson. That human being has intrinsic value purely off the strength of that. And you can respond accordingly. It doesn't mean you give people a free pass to walk over you. Obviously, you establish boundaries. But I think that people are too comfortable with the opposite end of that, of expecting human beings to justify their reason to exist in your peripheral, which I really do believe that it's an inevitable conclusion rooted in some of the points that we brought up before when you mentioned this concept of we start below baseline. And I wholly agree with that. Wholly agree with that. I think we start at an intrinsic deficit and we begin life trying to prove our existence, justified in a twisted understanding of survival of the fittest, when in reality, that's not how human beings are brought up. We're more than set it and forget it, like some sort of plant life or other mammals that, like horses or something, that come onto planet Earth already having instincts and all these other things. We only made it because we needed support systems and to rely on each other for our cultivation and development for a majority of our upbringing. And what we're getting is so much of that proxied out to and cheapened to, you have food, you got a roof over your head, what's the problem?
Yeah. But then we're also, when we're born in this deficit, it's because it's this Western notion of commodification. Everything has to have a dollar value. And so when we're born, it costs money to be born. There's a hospital bill, there's doctor bills, there's medicine bill. It costs money to do something that has been happening for hundreds of thousands of years. So, and
for free, mind you, for free.
Then
free.
Then we have to prove our value. And because the culture, society, different groups that we are assigned to or a part of, they dictate to us how we demonstrate our worthiness. So then we can very easily get into feeling worth less when we're not meeting that commodification, when we're not meeting the value system that was placed in front of us as the way to prove that our existence is worth something.
And it's validated in this idea of scarcity, where the lack of money justifies being this way because, quote, everyone has to pull their weight, end quote. Right. And I think it was important you also mentioned that this was a Western modality. I'll take a step back from the pixel, because I think that's a pixel that's part of this picture of the industrial, the first world, especially the first era of industrial revolutionary first world modality.
Yeah.
Because when people industrialized, they used the Western model. And I think that's where all of this came from. This Western model of industrialization that was adopted all over the developed first world is what created these problems. And what you're finding now is people are attempting to course correct that, which is why, and I'm digressing slightly, it's why I think we're shifting away in a global sense, away from culture and into civilization. And I think people are trying to get into civilization-based modalities, which have their own cultures affiliated with them, rather than tying technological advancement strictly to a Western modality like what happened in the first era.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
That unfortunately leaves a lot of us over here, SOL. Because we really bought into this idea of living at work, because this place was never meant to be a civilization. It was meant to be a business. So people got to play catch up very quickly, which is why I really want to have these conversations about transpersonal psychology and really getting into this idea of humanistic psychology, and really analyzing the makeup behind things like altruism, empathy, what really brings people to cooperate, why it's important, and what are we giving up for the sake of adaptation in this idea of, I'm going to call it, we'll just call it what it is, this commodification of human relationships.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is tick for tat related to money? Is this it? Is this it? Is this the strategy to have now? Or should you consider another path? Because once you go down too far this road, there may be things that will really cost you to try to fix again, if it's even possible.
Yeah, I agree. But I really like, the next time we talk, to really get into this transcending the avatar.
Yeah, let's do that, and we'll tie. We can tie that to the conversation of intrinsic value as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll be an excellent follow up for the topic, and then I think that'll give us an excellent follow through later on to get into some of the things that you were speaking earlier about how to actually act on some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So, the gut biome and some of the research going on there.
Yeah.
You can plan that later on as well. So I'll write that down and we'll cue that up for the next topic for sure.
Awesome.
But I guess it's been already an hour and a half. Hour and a half. Oh my goodness. If anybody has any questions in the audience, we can, if you got time, Maggie, we can take some. Otherwise, we can go ahead and close up the dojo and call it an episode. Let's see. Did get a few people say some things. We got Smitty came in earlier. What's going on? Os. BGS came in. That was a bit ago. Said cog in the machine. We're probably talking about people not being permitted to have roles. Well, not permitted. They're following the cookie cutter template of what it means to be human and resourceful. So,
Yeah.
your
It was when,
individuality.
I was talking about, teenagers, parents saying, no, you have to make money,
Right.
so
Right.
you
Yep.
have to be a cog in the machine.
Yep. Shout out to the Rockefellers.
Oh,
My
Lord.
goodness, man. We had David Dow. He said, I heard that the liberal arts was tied to the 7 Hermetic principles. They absolutely were, among other things, especially even as recent as the so-called founding fathers, man. That was something a lot of people took very serious, that had been bastardized with the introduction of public education. And we were just talking about the Rockefellers, but that may be a topic. If you haven't already covered it already on your channel, Maggie, I got a lot to say about public education and how they really set people up. And it was
I
all
have
in
brought it up before.
oh my goodness. It's all in the same time period between 1907 and 1913, where they just threw human beings under the bus to just become automatons. It's so
Right. I
frustrating.
don't want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers.
Anyway, I wish people would read. I mean, it's not like this is some kind of fan fiction. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. We're none of us were taught how to critically think. That is not what we were taught in school.
I'm gonna need to get you and a couple other people up here when I start my series on algorithmic power, because
Okay.
this stuff is concerning, and I think now more than ever, concepts like the inner space. I mean, the legal definition of inner thought and space, and how algorithms are essentially infringing and imposing decisions outside of people's cognitive awareness, is something that I don't think people are really taking serious enough. And I think it's the new form of power. I really do. I see it being in people's military budgets and all of that. I want to have that conversation in the future and really hash that out, because folks got to know.
Yeah. No, I
The
would
artists and
love to do that.
MCs. Yeah, just stuff to kind of throw in the back burner so you guys can kind of get a sense of what's coming on downstream. Got Aria came up. Us, good to see you. Chaos Rain. Hey, Nameless. Us, what's good, man? Got Tutriz. He said Hanzo versus Nakururu Ippon-sam. Shout out to Samurai Showdown, man. This was a good stage. I even got it at night. He's talking about the background.
Oh, it's a nice background.
Yeah, it's one of the temples that are in the Iga province. So it's a lot of symbolism going on with the stage. So do you think the liberal arts will help for understanding the future? I don't think humanity can separate itself from liberal arts to just express themselves differently. It just sucks that people are not. It hasn't been given its space within the society to express itself organically and meaningfully, especially when it comes to things such as rhetoric and the ability to really engage in debate. Because I don't see debate anymore. I just see punitive discussions. That's my subjective opinion, but
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and when we look at for the future, what liberal arts gives us is ethical reasoning.
oh
And
my
it's
goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Go ahead.
So, that ethical reasoning helps us with our critical thinking. It helps with communication. It even helps us to have like multiple viewpoints or like interdisciplinary insight. Just having that ethical reasoning, like we can have all the technology in the world. You know what I mean? Like STEM can build the machine. We can build the rocket. We can build the bomb. Liberal arts is where we say, should we? We can.
Mm-hmm.
Should we? And if we are, let's look at it from this perspective and this perspective and this perspective, and go through this reason, this ethical reasoning and critical thinking, and look at this interdisciplinary and really come up with an answer on an issue that technology makes issues simple. Liberal arts and ethical reasoning makes issues more complex. And you have to dig into the complexity, or else you're going to get the oopsie on the other side.
I submitted to complex design a formula, and I think it speaks to that. I said that innovation is creative impulse squared divided by scientific process. And I think it gets what you're talking about right there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the part. Ethics is all over that. If you don't start that seed from the beginning, it grows into something that, especially with the fourth industrial revolution, it's going to dehumanize and make. Let me not get into the fear mongering. I will say that ethics is probably the most important aspect right now as we speak for the next 5 to 10 years. So much so that if you don't focus on that, you'll probably lose everything. And I mean everything in the sense where not some cataclysmic, here goes freaking Skynet. I mean, as it relates to human autonomy, as it relates to what it means to be human, what it means to have meaningful relationships with other people, and what happens to motivation and meaning if these things are replaced so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many it's not that it's unforeseeable, but there's so much unintended and collateral damage that doesn't have to be physical in nature, that will be non-physical, that the scale of this can be so critical that it presents. Who could have foreseen that there would be more people who die of diabetes than war?
Well, then
or starvation.
Karma.
Well.
Because, how many times I also get into, like, how many times has cancer been cured or diabetes been cured, and those cures being suppressed because Big Pharma makes lots of money. So
off the strength of that. Yeah.
So that's a whole other talk as well, but it kind of fits into that, commodification of everything.
Yep.
Why do we have chemotherapy and radiation instead of sound therapy?
Yep. Especially when we already know that you can treat. They've been doing this off the and addressing lymphatic issues. It's been all in the disciplines of medicine, going all the way back to Imhotep, among other things.
Yeah.
The whole concept of the lute and the guitar and the piano is tied to all of that. What do they call that? There's a whole discipline, cyanetics or something like that. I'll look into that later. Cymatics, I think.
It's cymatics with a C.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, the sound resonances.
Yeah. Yep. Even to the point where they use it for building and structures. They understand how even that relates on a geometric level, like as far as architecture is concerned. So like this isn't science fiction. Like it's anyway, we're digressing to the point.
I know.
Preaching to the choir. Oh my goodness. We got some good stuff to asterisks, and we will definitely review that concept next week on dealing with the avatar and, going through that experience of cultivation while we're here. I think we'll start with that, getting into the intrinsic value in human beings. Well, yeah. Well, it doesn't look like we got too much coming up from the chat. We've got Ghetto Knock came up. Us. He says the high fructose corn syrup manufacturers. Yeah, the manufacturers, period, knew.
Mm-hmm.
He said the Moors used the string instrument for healing. Yep, tied to the 5 elements, that 5th ether chord.
I will just, can I tinfoil hat for a moment?
Oh, sure.
When we look at the Moors using stringed instruments for healing, I want you to also think about worldwide, a lot of these ancient buildings, ancient temples, even up to the 1617, early 1800s, all had bells. And a lot of
Yep.
times people used bells and bell frequencies for healings as well, which is why they used to make churches with organs that would pipe through the floors, and they would have bells in the tower because, first of all, it would create certain moods, but the bells could also be healing. And we
Mhm.
don't, and then you can look at different places where, colonizers would come in, and one of the first things they would do is destroy all the bells.
Yep. Even when if you went into places where you were in the Aboriginal belt, there were masters of acoustics that were there, which those buildings were designed a particular way to take advantage of those very principles.
Yeah.
So you saw that get disrupted, or people were displaced into other areas where they were removed from that sort of sonic resonance. Or if you want to get into even concepts like electromagnetic lay energy potential, that's a whole other conversation, why people are displaced and moved around that, or why certain buildings are built where they are, why they put churches there on purpose to hijack that frequency or to retard the frequency, etc. That's another convo. That's not even tinfoil hat. That's being pretty much exploited right now as we speak.
Oh, for sure.
Oh,
and all Catholic churches were built on top of ancient necropolis.
That's interesting.
Same reason people would make the necropolis, because it was an energy center. So that's where they would lay their dead.
It's that gateway theory, getting into that's more hermetics for you.
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna pause here because I already know I'll sit here and I'll talk another hour on this, and we're almost at the 2-hour mark. And I want to leave some for us to talk about in the future, because I think that's definitely worth exploring. And I'm about to go see Sinners this week finally, so I already know I'm gonna be on that type of time based off the previews I've seen and the topics people been brought up about that. So if we've got nothing else in the chat, Maggie, if you have any closing statements or anything you want to say now, you're more than welcome. I'll just close out when you're finished.
I think my closing statement just is, radical self-acceptance sounds like a very, very easy concept. Oh, I just accept myself. I think one of the biggest things you can do in trying to better yourself, or learn about yourself, or learn about things that make your material existence better, the very first thing actually you need to do is grant yourself some grace and realize that all of it is hard, change is hard, but incremental steps are always possible.
I am reminded of, and I'll go ahead and close out with this little story I did for The Nameless Swordsman. It is a clip from his journal that I will read as it relates to this idea of radical self-acceptance. Let me pull this up. The journal entry begins, quote, "A samurai of unprecedented renown once stated, quote, 'It is essential for a samurai to strive with all his heart, to understand that it is difficult to even reach the average if he does not have the intention of surpassing others in whatever he does,' end quote. I do not fundamentally disagree with this. However, I am no samurai. I have no clan. I have no lord. I have no daimyo, shogun. I have no title. I have no land. I have no stipend. I have no sashimono. I have no family, daisho, or oyoroi, armor. All that I am is but a man with a blade in his choices. I am no greater or lesser than anything under heaven. Thus, for one such as I, there is no other than myself, which whom I may actually surpass, as it is understood by the previous passage. For some of you, this may call into question the matter of scale. It would be fair to ask, quote, still, you are a bushi, a warrior. Would it not be false to only be strong in one's own mind? How is this not delusion by definition, end quote? To that, I say, there is only one answer. One must resolutely face adversity and overcome it. Tension has risen within the shroud, and adversity now presents itself. So too shall my blade. I take upon my brush and ink this on the 4th day of the 11th month, the year of the ox and the hour of the dragon. Signed, the Nameless Swordsman. With that, to the founders of the space, os. To those of you in the chat and the playback, os. This has been the Nameless Protagonist, Maggie Thompson. Enjoy the rest of your day, and remember, ware ware no michi. This is the way.